Christians have normally claimed that God has revealed himself decisively, not primarily in the realm of existential consciousness, not simply in the hidden recesses of religious feelings, but in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. In other words, God has acted within the space-time universe, specifically in the dirt and drama of first-century Palestine, to make good on his covenant promises to Israel by sending his Son in the likeness of human flesh. This means that God has acted within what we call history, the flow and flux of actual events, and that therefore, if we want to know who God really is, we must study this history. We must get to know the world of Jesus' day and understand who he was and what he did and said and meant within that world. Some people have objected to this historical enterprise. Some have seen the task as irrelevant for their own situation. Historical events might have provided the foundations for the building of the church, but no one invests huge amounts of time inspecting the foundations when there are prayers to pray, sermons to write, the elderly to visit, services to prepare. Others turn their noses up at the detailed contents they have to pick through. How can Iron Age texts possibly be relevant in the Internet age? Whatever people think the texts once meant, they think, is mostly irrelevant to the meanings we ascribe to them now. Besides, they were primitive and we are modern. The flaws in such implicit arguments should be obvious. You may not want to inspect the foundations, but if the building starts to fall down, you wish you had. If you can make the texts mean whatever you want now, then chaos is come again. Some again have warned that all historical knowledge is partial. They've objected that skeptics have used history as a weapon to undermine faith. They've pointed out it's always possible for us to invent a historical picture for ourselves and worship that instead of the real Jesus. But all this is like saying that because the garden grows weeds, we'd better pave it over with concrete. No, let's work on the flowers and the vegetables. We have to do history. There is no excuse and no escape. The reason why we study the history of the New Testament, after all, is that Jesus and his first followers constitute the basis for normative Christianity. This normativity emerges from the belief that God has revealed himself in the historical events to which the New Testament bears witness. Then, as a second-order thing, though still vital, God is revealed in the writings that make up the New Testament itself. And then third, God reveals himself by the Spirit in the transformative, personal, and communal effect which living by this story produces, what some might call Christian experience, though that's a loose and slippery phrase. From very early times, Christians have firmly believed that they were committed to living and believing and behaving in some sort of continuity with the New Testament. And therefore, of course, with the Old Testament too, since the New Testament claims to be picking up the narrative where Israel's scriptures leave off. This belief gained additional momentum as a result of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformers appealed to sola scriptura, scripture alone, as a way of insisting that what mattered was the unique, one-off events of the first century, focused on the events concerning Jesus himself, rather than any traditions, however venerable, that might have been developed subsequently. Many in other great Christian traditions would agree firmly with the Protestant principle that reading the New Testament is where the Christian must start, in an understanding of the faith. In such reading and understanding, he or she, the Christian, is equipped, challenged, reinforced, and given a sound basis for belief and life. And if that's the case, then study of Jesus and the New Testament within the historical context of the first century is and remains a necessary part of Christian discipleship. The approach to reading the New Testament as history which we commend here is critical realism. This is a way of describing the process of knowing that acknowledges the reality of the thing known as something other than the knower, hence realism. There really is something out there which we can in principle know, even if our own knowledge of it is partial and provisional. That's why it must be critical realism. The only access we have to this reality outside ourselves is gained by what we might see as the spiraling path of appropriate dialogue or conversation between the knower and the thing known. We can't assume we got it all straight at the first shot. The data in whatever field must have the chance to answer back, just as in a conversation with someone else, we check back to see if we've understood what's being said. This is true for all fields of knowledge. History is a specialized branch of inquiry, but this process of to and fro of critical reflection is common to all knowing at both everyday and laboratory levels. Knowledge, in other words, although in principle concerning realities independent of the knower, is never itself independent of the process of knowing. Our problems about how historical knowledge works is affected by the cultural moods of the last century and more in our world. To give an analogy, consider 3 windows. Modernity, the worldview of Enlightenment rationalism, liked to think of itself as looking through a transparent window that allowed one to see perfectly through to the other side, as long as it was sunny. In other words, truth is easily found if you have good sources and good methods. Postmodernity, by contrast, is basically saying in response that the window is really a mirror and that all you see is little more than your own reflection, though you might get lucky if you unconsciously peer through a crack or catch a glimpse of something behind the mirror. In other words, there might be some truth out there, but you'll have a hard time distinguishing it from your own reflection. Critical realism responds to both. Critical realism says that the window does indeed have a dark tint caused by the gaps in our knowledge and the shading of our own location. It agrees that part of our own reflection does indeed appear on the window, but it insists that there is something we can actually see through the window, something that is not part of our own making. In other words, truth really can be seen, even if never as fully or clearly as we might like. Once again, this is true for many fields, of which history is simply one. Modernity exalted itself in claims of incorrigible certainty. Postmodernity has basked in ambiguity and irony. Critical realism attempts to provide both sobriety and clarity to the historical task. The critical realist therefore says that there is something in the text to be known, something in history to be found, even if the knowing and the finding is never infallible or complete. The alternative to absolute claims, we really know it all, is not anarchic interpretation, we can't really know so let's just make it up, but an adequate knowledge attained by a critical interaction between the subject and the object of study. We really do know that Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. We really do know that Jesus of Nazareth died on a Roman cross, having announced that God was at last becoming king. We really do know a great deal about what that claim would have meant at the time, and how Jesus himself gave it his own personal twist. In all of this, one can believe in a thing called history without thinking that one has full possession of it. That's because all our knowledge, including all our historical knowledge, is provisional and open to correction. But this relativity of all historical knowledge doesn't present an insurmountable barrier to speaking truly about things that happened in the past. For the critical realist historian, history is there, independent and accessible. Of course, as with all knowledge, in order to describe what we're seeing, we need some kind of interpretative framework. In other words, a hypothesis. We test hypotheses, as do the hard sciences, by seeing whether they can explain all the relevant data, whether they do so within an appropriate simplicity or even elegance, and whether they shed light on other areas. New knowledge, in this case the discovery of a new scroll or coin or whatever, or a fresh and compelling way of reading familiar texts, can force us to reconsider what we thought we knew, just as happens in any other field. This is actually part of being human, and as Christians, we shouldn't be afraid of it. We shouldn't imagine that this might jeopardize our faith. Far from it. It ought to be a growth point. So what counts as a justified hypothesis or a warranted belief when it comes to history? You need a large framework on which you can draw, a way of describing the coherence of people and events in their own context. History studies human motivations as well as bare events. There's an important disclaimer here. History is not a matter of psychology. Getting insight into someone's psyche is hard enough when they're in the room with you, sharing your culture and talking your language. When we explore the reasons why ancient Rome needed a stable Middle East, this isn't a matter of psychoanalyzing Roman emperors, it's a matter of history. The answer, by the way, is that Rome needed to protect the grain supply from Egypt. It isn't a matter of psychology, but of history, that we understand why Herod the Great was rebuilding and beautifying the temple in Jerusalem. It was part of royal ideology, an attempt to legitimate himself as the true king of the Jews. It isn't a matter of psychology, but of history, that we see why John the Baptist was plunging people into the River Jordan. This was a symbolic new exodus. And it isn't a matter of psychology, but of history, that we can see how many strands of first century Jewish thought come together in the vocation of Jesus of Nazareth. That Jesus believed it was his vocation to announce that this was the time for God to become king, and to focus that claim on what he himself was doing and on the fate he believed he was called to suffer. It's a matter of history, not of psychological speculation, that we can see how his own unique vocation made the sense it did within the first century Jewish world. This then is how history works. As historians, we must attune our imagination sympathetically to the entire culture of the day in order to understand how it might be thinkable, how it might make sense to do and say things which the evidence suggests people did and said. This requires a leap to a hypothesis, exactly as in the hard sciences, and in history, the hypothesis will always be some kind of story which will explain the phenomena before us. Stories are, after all, one of the most basic modes of human life and are a characteristic expression of worldviews. Human life is constituted by a series of stories, implicit and explicit, that make sense of experience and evidence and that allow us to describe them in a coherent manner. You can see how this works out, for instance, in the Jewish world by the story which they recite at every Passover. My father was a wandering Aramean. He went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. This story sums up the events and experiences that defined and define the Jewish people. It frames and contextualizes their beliefs, identity, and hopes. They thought of themselves, in Jesus' day, as Exodus people waiting eagerly for the new Exodus. As historians, then, we are principally storytellers, trying to get inside the storied lives of ancient peoples, filled as they are, of course, with diverse and often competing elements and stories, and then constructing our own explanatory story to account for theirs. How does this relate to our historical inquiry into the New Testament? When we study the New Testament, we find ourselves describing a certain group of first century Jews, the first followers of Jesus, to whom quite early on a larger group of non-Jews were joined to form this unprecedented body they called the ecclesia, the church. They held one particular variant of the first century Jewish worldview. And this strange group was saying, in effect, the hope at the heart of the Jewish worldview, the hope for the new Exodus, has been fulfilled in these events concerning Jesus. And they chose to say this in the most natural and most obviously Jewish way they knew, precisely by telling a story, encoding in a narrative the sum of their worldview and beliefs. We can see that process going on not only in the four Gospels, but in the letters and in the Revelation of John. Therefore, a chief task of New Testament study is to construct a hypothesis which explains the story of the first Christians within the storied world of Jews and Greeks and Romans of the time. If Jesus himself was a fully human being, as the Church has always acknowledged and indeed celebrated, we are summoned to know him in this way too, not to the exclusion of the personal knowing of Jesus, which Christians experience in prayer and sacrament, in scripture and in ministry to the poor, but to function together with that personal experience, and to make sure that the personal experience doesn't shade off into fantasy and self-deception. History itself shows that this is all too present